Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Gray Matter. Well, as you know, probably the foremost public policy issue, the one that dominates all of our federal government's policy right now, is climate change. And of course, there's a great divergence of opinion about climate change. Is it real? Is it fake? Are what we're being told, is it true? Is it false? And so, as you know, we talk a lot about this on the show. We've had Dr. Patrick Moore on the show to talk about his books. We've talked about people like Bjorn Lomborg, Michael Schellenberger, and Alex Epstein. So I thought it would be great to have someone on the show who's an American author who's just written a great new book. It's called Climate and Energy Lies: Expensive, Dangerous, and Destructive. His name is Frank Lasee. Welcome to the program, Frank. Thanks for being on the program today to talk about your book.
Hey, thanks for having me on. And you're absolutely correct. This is one of the most important topics out there. And really, it could be the most important topic because energy and food supply and having abundant, reliable, affordable energy, and then also a good, solid food supply are important to modern life, important to the 8 billion people on Earth. It's important to each and every one of us. And it affects economic policy in a whole lot of ways, because when our energy costs are expensive and spiking and continuing to rise, contrary to the lies that they've been telling us that somehow wind and solar would lower our electric rates and become cheaper. And in fact, everywhere in the world where they add more of them, they become far more expensive. Denmark, Germany, and the United Kingdom all are farther along the path in wind and solar, and the people there pay triple the electric rates we pay now here in the US, the average electric rate, and they are continuing to climb. And when you're spending more money on energy or on food, as we've all experienced the food inflation lately, last few years, you have less to spend on everything else. So everything else suffers as well. And then the people who work in those industries suffer, and it creates a negative spiral in the economy.
Yeah, this is so true. And of course, in Canada, we have something called a climate tax, even though we produce less than 1% of all the carbon emissions. So, Frank, we want to talk about your book, but before we go there, I want to read something to you. That's kind of funny. Well, not funny, haha, but funny in the sense that what we're talking about. This is a piece that says that the Arctic Ocean is warming up. Icebergs are growing scarcer, and in some places, the seals are finding the water too hot, according to a report to the Commerce Department yesterday from U.S. Consulate at Bergen, Norway. Reports from fishermen, seal hunters, and explorers all point to a radical change in climate conditions and hitherto unheard of temperatures in the Arctic zone. Exploration expeditions report that scarcely any ice has been met as far north as 81 degrees 29 minutes. And soundings to a depth of 3,100 meters show the Gulf Stream still very warm. Great masses of ice have been replaced by moraines of earth and stones, the report continued, while at many points well-known glaciers have entirely disappeared. Very few seals and no whitefish are found in the eastern Arctic, while vast shoals of herring and smelts, which have never before ventured so far north, are being encountered in the old seal fishing grounds. Within a few years, it is predicted that due to the ice melt, the sea will rise and make most coast cities uninhabitable. That was published on November 2nd, 1922 in the Washington Post. So, Frank, what is going on? Why are we being? What's the truth about climate change? What's the truth that you talk about in your book?
Well, and it's interesting. I was smiling while you were reading that because I figured the punchline was that this was from the 1920s or 30s. It's all cyclical, and we have been warming out of the little ice age from about 1350 to 1850. It was much cooler then, and cold times are worse for weather, and they are worse for growing crops, and people have famine and die. And you're pointing out by reading that article that this has happened before in the Arctic. And in fact, the Earth warming out of the little ice age from 1850, also known more romantically as pre-industrial times, that the climate alarmists like to use, because I think it's hard to sell us that if we're a few degrees warmer than the little ice age, that's somehow a bad thing. And that's part of these lies that are just told to us and the propaganda that we get continuously. And in fact, the temperature records are pretty clear, and we have very sketchy worldwide temperature records prior to about 1960. So when they start telling you that we know precisely what the temperature was back in 1880, 1920 worldwide, we certainly don't. And even today, it's questionable, even with 60,000 stations around the Earth for one temperature global that isn't showing much warming at all, that we don't really have accurate records. And in fact, NOAA and NASA are cooking the record books. They've gone back and adjusted away the cooling period. So we're told a lot of things that simply aren't true. And that's what my book exposes them. And there's a lot of unsaid lies as well, such as, if we limit or somehow stop CO2 from going in the atmosphere, that the weather will get better. It's one of those hidden lies that said that somehow the weather will stop. Well, no, it won't, no matter what. We're always going to have weather events. So we're rife with these, and they're being used for a purpose to drive some very expensive, harmful, destructive energy policies.
In reading your book, which I found fascinating, your point seems to be that climate change policy is more dangerous than climate change itself. And sort of putting your book in the context of some others that I've read, for example, Bjorn Lomborg, who thinks that that CO2 and climate change is a problem, but it's one that is quite manageable through the proper application of technology. Now, you don't appear to be in that camp. You seem to be more in the camp of Dr. Patrick Moore, who basically says that all of the climate change propaganda is false and lies. Is that a fair assessment, or are you sort of somewhere in between those two camps?
No, I'm very much with Patrick Moore, in that more CO2 is good. It's necessary plant food. It's also necessary for our lives. Humans inhale CO2. If you put someone in a room with no CO2 at all, they would die. They would die. If we get below 200 parts per million, about half of where we are right now, plant matter would all die in the world, and so would we, because we'd have nothing to eat. So they've demonized something that is odorless, colorless, and it puts and soda, we call it soda here in Wisconsin, or pop, puts the carbonation in. We know what carbonation is. It makes the beer sparkle, champagne sparkle. There's nothing to fear with it, and more of it. And they add it to greenhouses because it is airborne miracle grow, and it really enhances plant growth a lot. NASA has pointed out, and they've done studies, that the world is about 30% greener over the last 40 years, and they attribute 70% of that to the more CO2 in the atmosphere. The Earth is greening, and that's a good thing.
In Michael Schellenberger's book, Apocalypse Never, he makes the point that in the first part of this century, more people were raised out of poverty than throughout all of human history, and this was done mainly through energy production and advances in technology and food production. But that a lot of that advancement was sort of undone by COVID. And you make this point now that the suppression of energy production seems to be linked to these globalist policy, which include, depopulation of 7/8 of the Earth, and this idea that there's some connection between suppression of energy and massive government technocratic control. Am I getting off the mark, or is there an actual connection there?
It is being used by the global socialist communists, the globalists, the UN, in particular the United Nations, to further their power and their gains. And it's telling that the executive director of the United Nations, Antonio Guterres, is a socialist. He is a member of the Socialist Party. He was elected as a socialist in Portugal. They are using this for a control issue. And it's very expensive for all of us. And warming is actually beneficial to everyone in the Earth, and the Earth is getting greener. These are good things.
It's very bad for people in the United States and Canada, but you make the point in the book that it's even worse for people in other parts of the world who do not have the same access to energy or to food that we do. And really, these developing countries really want energy. They look at countries like Canada and the US, and they see that energy and the ability to have it in a cheap form is a key to prosperity and growth, and also to things like food production. But meanwhile, in places like Denmark, you posted out on your X page, Denmark is the first country in the world to introduce a carbon tax on cows and agriculture. It's hard to imagine Houston in Texas, sort of banning beef. But this is really happening. As you say, you use the word insidious, but there is a deeper agenda that's connected to depopulation, isn't there?
Yes, there absolutely is. And there are signs of this around the world. The largest bank in Australia now sends all of their credit card and debit card users, based on their purchases, a carbon, CO2. They're also beta testing a CO2 tracking card in Sweden, so that everything you do, including eating and watching Netflix or using the internet, they're tracking all of your CO2, or they call it carbon. And that's a forerunner to provide, when things get expensive and short enough, food and energy. I think they want to put us on rations. There have been some of the climate crazed who have called to declare a climate emergency and go on wartime footing and ration energy and food. So they'll put a ration on us. They'll give us a ration card for carbon, CO2, and then you can buy what they let you buy. You can't buy meat, but you can buy bugs. You can't buy beer, but you can buy whatever they want you to buy. And that's how insidious this is. That's where they eventually want to head. And then once they're there, then they'll just ratchet it down and ruin our lifestyles. And if people knew this, we would never vote for this knowingly. But we're getting it forced upon us.
Meanwhile, and you talk about in your book, some of the quote unquote green forms of energy production are not very green at all. For example, we saw recently with the hurricanes that went through Florida that these solar farms were ripped apart, causing massive, actually environmental damage. It's going to cost billions of dollars to clean all that up. And of course, solar doesn't produce very much energy compared to fossil fuels or nuclear. And you also posted out offshore wind is a killer of whale, dolphins, other mammals, fish, and lobsters, and they will not withstand powerful hurricanes. So really, these forms of energy that we're being sort of sold on, wind and solar, first of all, are not a reasonable, realistic alternative to fossil fuels. And more than that, they actually cause as much or more real environmental damage than using fossil fuels, don't they?
Well, that's absolutely correct. And all of them, we've been told that's another one of the lies, and it's discussed in my book more, that wind and solar are going to make our electric grids cheaper, less cost. They aren't. They're going to make them more expensive. The reason they make them more expensive, and that's part of what we do on our website, truthandenergyandclimate.com. We also have a weekly energy and climate newsletter to help expose the truth of these, is that they actually drive up the costs of our electricity. And it's worse than that. It's more insidious than that. In the big picture of things, all the money we're spending on subsidies for wind and solar is borrowed money, adding to our $35 trillion national debt, adding to our $1 trillion national interest payments. And then we're purchasing 80% of that from China. So China is building our wind and solar infrastructure. They're our political rival in the world. They are a totalitarian regime. They are building their military very strong. They have bad intentions. They're a proven bully of other nations to get what they want. They steal trades, patents. They do a lot of bad acting in the world. And if they become the dominant country in the world, we are in rough shape. So we're feeding the Chinese machine while adding to our national debt, while making our electricity more expensive.